The laughter carried across the gravel lot outside Hendrickson's Feed and Supply, sharp enough to cut through the wind. Margaret Cole stood at the counter, her boots caked in dried mud, a stack of unpaid invoices folded inside her coat pocket, like a wound she kept pressing on. Behind her, 3 men leaned against a truck bed, grinning at something one of them had just said. She didn't need to hear the words to know they were about her. She heard them anyway. 60 acres of dust and debt, one man said, shaking his head. Woman's been trying to squeeze blood from a rock for 2 years now. Margaret's jaw tightened. She kept her eyes on the counter, on the clerk counting out her change, on anything that wasn't the sound of her own name dissolving into a joke. Behind her, a truck door creaked open. A tall man in a weathered hat had been standing near the diesel pump the whole time, saying nothing, watching everything. He'd heard it too, but instead of turning away, he studied the horizon in the direction of Coal Land, the direction everyone assumed held nothing worth studying at all. What he'd noticed, nobody else in that parking lot had noticed in 10 years, and it was about to change everything. If you've ever been underestimated, or told the thing you're fighting for isn't worth saving, stay with this one. Subscribe, drop a like, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know. Margaret Cole was 43 years old, and she had buried her husband Daniel 3 winters ago on a ridge that overlooked the barn he'd built with his own hands. She still walked up there some evenings, not to grieve exactly, but to remember that the land had once meant something other than a monthly reminder of everything she couldn't afford to fix. The farm had belonged to Daniel's family for 2 generations before it became hers alone. 61 acres of rolling pasture and cropland outside the small town of Larkspur Hollow, the kind of place that used to feed half the county before the drought years and the debt years, and the years when Daniel's tractor sat broken in the shed because there was no money to repair it and no time to learn how herself. She had learned since. That was the part nobody in town seemed to notice. She'd learned to read a soil test, to time a planting around a frost line, to nurse a sick calf through the night with nothing but instinct and a borrowed heat lamp. She wasn't helpless. She was outmatched by drought, by debt, by a bank that had stopped returning her calls with any patience left. The East Fields hadn't produced a real crop in 3 seasons. The cattle herd had shrunk from 40 head to 11. The barn roof leaked in 4 places she knew about, and probably more she didn't. Weeds had taken the old vegetable rows behind the house, and rust had started climbing the fence posts. Like it too, was tired of holding on. But there was one place on the farm that didn't behave like the rest. Along the northern boundary, where an old stone line ran through what used to be a hay meadow, the grass stayed a deep, stubborn green, even in the driest weeks of August. Margaret had noticed it for years and never thought much of it, just assumed it was some quirk of drainage, water pooling where it shouldn't. The cattle, when she still had enough to graze that section, always drifted toward it first, lingering there longer than anywhere else on the property. She'd never asked why. She had too many other fires to put out. It was, without her knowing it, the first thread of a much larger story. The talk in town had been building for months, the way gossip does in a place small enough that everyone's business becomes everyone's entertainment. At the diner, at the co-op, in line at the post office, the Cole farm had become shorthand for a cautionary tale. Proof, people said, that some land simply wasn't meant to produce anymore. Ray Tolliver, who ran the hardware store, was the loudest about it. He didn't dislike Margaret personally. He simply believed, with the confidence of a man who'd never missed a mortgage payment, that stubbornness dressed itself up as virtue far too often in farming country. "She's throwing good money after bad," he told anyone who'd listen. "Should have sold 2 years ago and saved herself the heartbreak." Then there was Carol Whitfield, who ran into Margaret at church more Sundays than not, and always offered the same tight, sympathetic smile, before turning to whoever stood nearby and murmuring something about how sad it was, really, watching a good family's land go to waste like that. And there was Dale Pruitt, a land buyer from 2 counties over who had made Margaret 3 separate offers in the past year, each one lower than the last, each one delivered with the practiced warmth of a man who wanted something and knew patience was the cheapest way to get it. Dale never laughed at her. Dale was worse. Dale waited. It was outside the feed store that the word finally landed the way words sometimes do, all at once and impossible to unhear. "Worthless," Ray had said, loud enough to carry. "That whole spread's worthless, and everybody but her seems to know it." Margaret didn't turn around. She paid for her feed, thanked the clerk, and walked to her truck with her spine straight and her throat tight. and she did not let a single tear fall until she was 3 miles down the county road, alone, with no one left to perform strength for. Wade Marsh had built Marsh Cattle Company from 400 acres his father left him into nearly 11,000, spread across 3 counties, and in doing so had become the kind of wealthy that Larkspur Hollow measured other men against. But Wade didn't wear that wealth the way people expected. He drove a 15-year-old truck with a cracked windshield he kept meaning to fix. His hands were rope-scarred and sun-cured, hands that had strung fence and pulled calves and hauled feed right alongside every man he employed. People respected Wade not because of what he owned, but because of what he knew. He could look at a stretch of pasture and tell you, within a season, whether it was overgrazed. He could smell rain 2 days out. He'd forgotten more about cattle and soil than most men in the county would ever learn. He'd heard Ray's comment at the feed store the same as everyone else. He hadn't said anything. That wasn't his way. But he'd watched Margaret Cole's face in the reflection of the store window, watched her absorb the insult without giving anyone the satisfaction of a reaction, and something about that quiet dignity stayed with him longer than the joke itself. What stayed with him more was what he'd seen driving past her property the week before. That green stripe along the northern fence line, cutting through pasture that should have been the same dead gold brown as everything else in a dry August. He'd noticed it the way he noticed most things, without meaning to, the way 30 years of reading land had trained his eye to catch what didn't belong. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now, standing by his truck, watching Margaret Cole drive away with her jaw set and her eyes wet, he found himself thinking of nothing else. Why would one strip of ground refuse to die with the rest of it? He climbed into his truck and, instead of turning toward home, pointed it in the direction of the Cole place. He didn't go that first day. Instead, he called ahead, an old habit, respect for another person's property, and asked Margaret if he could take a look at her north fence line. Told her, honestly enough, that he'd noticed some green grass from the road, and was curious whether her drainage tile ran anywhere near his own property line downhill. It wasn't entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either, and it gave her a reason to say yes that didn't feel like charity. Margaret met him at the gate the following morning, wary in the particular way of someone who'd been made promises before. Wade didn't waste her time with pleasantries. He walked the fence line slowly, crouching every few yards, running dry pasture grass through his fingers, comparing color and texture the way another man might compare paint samples. "How long's this section stayed green in dry months?" he asked. "Long as I can remember," Margaret said. "Daniel used to say it was just low ground." "Low ground holds water after a rain," Wade said. "It doesn't hold water 3 weeks into a drought with no rain at all." He crouched near the old stone line, brushing back a curtain of overgrown grass to reveal weathered rock beneath, stacked with more intention than nature would have managed on its own. "This isn't a natural rock outcrop. Somebody built this," Margaret frowned. "It's just an old wall, been here since before Daniel's grandfather. Maybe," Wade said, "or maybe it's not a wall at all." He asked if he could dig, just a shallow test hole, nothing that would damage anything. Margaret, more out of curiosity now than trust, said yes. 18 inches down, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock and wasn't root. Clay pipe, hand-fired, the kind farmers laid 100 years ago when they wanted to move water somewhere on purpose. "Somebody engineered this ground," Wade said quietly, almost to himself. "This whole section was built to hold and move water. It still is." Margaret stood over the little trench, staring at a piece of buried pipe that had apparently been doing its quiet work for a century without a single soul noticing, including her. The question wasn't whether the land had potential. The question was why nobody had used it in so long, and why the rest of the farm, just 100 yards away, had been left to die of thirst. Wade came back 3 more times that week, and each visit peeled back another layer. He found a second run of the same clay pipe curving southeast, buried beneath what was now an overgrown fence row. He found a shallow depression in a far pasture that, when he studied the elevation, could only be explained as the collapsed remains of an old holding pond, a reservoir, built to capture runoff and gravity-feed it across dozens of acres that hadn't seen consistent water in longer than Margaret had been alive. "Your husband's grandfather built an entire irrigation system," Wade told her, standing over a county plat map he'd borrowed from the courthouse. "Gravity-fed, no pumps needed, which means no fuel cost, no electric cost. This wasn't some subsistence operation. Look here." He tapped an old surveyor's note in the corner of the map, a mention of improved acreage, irrigated, dated decades back. At some point, this was one of the most productive parcels in the county. "So what happened?" Margaret asked. That was the real question, and Wade didn't have an answer yet. Somewhere between that surveyor's note and the parched, cracked earth she'd inherited, someone had let the system fail, or something had made it fail. He found the first real clue in the county records office 2 days later. A permit filed nearly 15 years ago, requesting a modification to water rights along Coal Creek, the same waterway that had once fed that buried pipe system. The permit had been approved. The name on the filing wasn't Cole. It was Pruitt. Margaret's mortgage note came due at the worst possible time, the way these things always seemed to. The bank had extended her twice already, and the loan officer's voice on the phone carried the particular flatness of someone reading from a script he didn't enjoy reading. 90 days, he told her. 90 days, or the bank would be forced to begin foreclosure proceedings. 90 days felt like nothing when measured against fields that hadn't produced income in 3 years. Dale Pruitt showed up 2 days after that phone call, driving his clean white truck up her gravel drive with an offer already printed and folded in his jacket pocket, as though he'd been waiting for this exact moment. He was polite. He was patient. He told her he understood how hard this must be, and that he only wanted to help her avoid something worse. Margaret didn't sign anything, but standing in her kitchen after he left, staring at the number on that offer sheet, a number that wouldn't cover her debts and would erase every trace of Daniel's family from this ground, she felt, for the first time, the real weight of losing. Wade drove out that evening and found her sitting on the porch steps, the offer sheet still in her hand. "That water rights filing," he said, sitting down beside her without asking permission, the way old friends do even when they've only recently become friends at all. "It was filed by a company called Cedar Ridge Holdings. Took me a while to find who's behind it. It's Pruitt's." Margaret looked up. "He didn't just want your land cheap," Wade said. "He diverted your water rights 15 years ago, upstream, before your husband's family even realized what they'd lost. Cut the flow feeding that whole irrigation system down to almost nothing. Your land didn't fail on its own, Margaret. Somebody starved it. The betrayal of that truth was its own kind of grief, sharper in some ways than watching a farm simply wither from bad luck. Someone had wanted this outcome. Someone had engineered her humiliation as carefully as Daniel's grandfather had once engineered that irrigation system." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth as something else fell into place. The summers Daniel had spent hauling water tanks out to the back pasture by truck, always brushing off her questions with a tired joke about a dry stretch that never seemed to end. He must have known the flow was wrong and simply refused to let her see how hard he was working to hide it from her. He'd kept the place alive through sheer stubbornness for over a decade, patching around a wound he never explained. It was only in the 3 years since his death, without his labor to paper over what the diversion had done, that the land had finally been allowed to show everyone exactly what 15 years of stolen water looked like. "So what do I do with that?" she asked. "I still owe the bank in 90 days. Wade was quiet a long moment, looking out over the dark fields. "We don't need 90 days to prove what this land can do," he said. "We need results. And we need them fast enough that the bank sees them before that number ever comes due." The first setback arrived within a week. A summer storm rolled through Larkspur Hollow with more wind than rain, and it tore loose the temporary pump line Wade had helped Margaret run from the creek to prime the old gravity system while they worked to legally restore her water rights. 2 days of work, undone in an afternoon. Margaret stood in the mud afterward, staring at the wreckage of pipe and fittings, feeling the old, familiar despair creeping back in. "Maybe they're right," she said quietly. "Maybe this land just doesn't want to be saved." Wade didn't offer comfort. He offered a solution. "Ground's not the problem," he said, already crouching to inspect the broken coupling. "This fitting's cheap plastic. Wrong choice for creek-fed pressure. My mistake, not yours. We rebuild it with galvanized joints this time, and we bury the line 18 inches instead of leaving it exposed. It'll hold through worse than this." They rebuilt it together, the two of them and, increasingly, Margaret's 14-year-old daughter, Ellie, who had started coming home from school and heading straight to the fields instead of her room. Wade brought 2 of his own hands over one weekend to help relay pipe. He didn't do the work for Margaret. He worked alongside her, correcting her grip on a wrench, teaching her to read the slope of a trench line by eye. Slowly, water began to move again through channels that had been dry for 15 years. The change came in increments too small for anyone but Margaret to notice at first. A strip of pasture near the old stone wall greened up thicker than she'd ever seen it. Then a second strip, where Wade had helped her till in a cover crop of clover to rebuild the exhausted soil before planting anything that needed to earn money right away. He explained it to her plainly. The ground had been starved of both water and organic matter for so long that throwing seed straight into it would have been throwing money into dust. The clover would fix nitrogen, hold moisture, and rebuild what years of neglect had stripped away. By the 6th week, the cover crop had transformed 6 acres from cracked brown earth into a rolling carpet of green. Margaret brought her 11 remaining cattle to graze it in tight, rotated sections the way Wade showed her, moving them every few days instead of letting them wear one pasture down to nothing. And for the first time in years, she watched her herd actually gain weight instead of merely surviving. The old fruit trees behind the barn, 3 ancient apple trees Daniel had always meant to prune and never found time for, produced the heaviest crop anyone could remember once the restored water table reached their roots again. Margaret filled crates with apples she hadn't expected and sold them at a roadside stand that, within a month, was drawing regular customers from town. Ellie started keeping a small notebook of what they planted and where, numbers and dates in a careful, determined hand. Margaret watched her daughter's confidence grow alongside the crops and understood that whatever else came of this, that alone had been worth the fight. Wade found the last piece of the puzzle almost by accident, cross-referencing old agricultural survey records with modern soil tests he'd sent off to a lab 2 counties over. The results confirmed something he'd suspected since that first shovel strike into buried clay pipe. Beneath the neglect and the dust, coal land sat on some of the richest, most mineral-dense soil in the entire valley, the kind other farmers spent years and small fortunes trying to build through compost and cover cropping alone. It wasn't just recoverable. Once properly watered, it was exceptional, capable of supporting not just pasture, but high-value crops that could command real prices at regional markets. The land hadn't been worthless. It had been starved on purpose, by a man counting on nobody looking closely enough to notice. The 90-day deadline arrived before the water rights case had even reached a hearing date, but Margaret walked into the bank that week with something she hadn't had on her last visit. Numbers. 6 weeks of cattle sale receipts, a growing list of apple stand regulars, and Wade's soil test results laid out on the loan officer's desk like evidence in a trial. It wasn't enough money yet to satisfy the note outright, but it was enough proof of a genuine turnaround that the bank agreed to a 90-day extension of its own. Time enough, barely, to let the water rights case run its course. The county water board hearing took place on a Thursday morning in the community center that doubled as Larkspur Hollow's only real gathering space, and half the town found a reason to be there. Word had gotten around, the way it always did, that something was about to happen regarding the coal place, and curiosity had outpaced even the appetite for gossip. Margaret sat at the front with Ellie beside her, wearing a plain blue dress and an expression that had nothing performative in it at all, just quiet, earned steadiness. Wade sat 1 row back, close enough to be present, far enough to let this belong to her. The county water official read through the filing history of Cedar Ridge Holdings, the 15-year-old diversion permit, the geological survey confirming the original creek flow, and the restored irrigation records showing exactly how much productivity had returned to coal land in a matter of weeks, once water was allowed to move where it always should have. Dale Pruitt sat near the back, his face gone the color of old paper, saying nothing as the board voted unanimously to restore full historic water rights to the coal property and refer the original diversion filing for further review. Ray Tolliver, seated 3 rows from Margaret, stared at the folder of soil test results being passed around the room, results showing land he'd called worthless testing among the richest in the valley, and found, for possibly the first time in his life, that he had nothing to say. Margaret didn't gloat. She didn't need to. She simply stood, thanked the board, and walked out into the parking lot where autumn light fell gold across a town that was only now beginning to understand what it had almost let slip away. They laughed because all they could see was what the land had become, Wade said to her afterward, standing beside his truck in that same parking lot where this had all begun. Nobody bothered asking what it used to be, or what it still could be, if somebody cared enough to look. Margaret looked out toward the ridge where Daniel was buried, toward fields that were, for the first time in years, genuinely green. I stopped being able to see it myself, she admitted. Somewhere in all the debt and the exhaustion, I just started believing them. Land doesn't lie, Wade said. People do, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes just because they've never learned to look past the surface of a thing. There was no triumphant speech, no dramatic confrontation. There didn't need to be. The soil test results, the restored water, the loaded apple crates at her roadside stand, those spoke louder than anything either of them could have said. A year later, Cole Farm looked like a different property entirely, though it was really the same 61 acres, simply returned to what it had always been capable of becoming. The east fields grew a rotation of vegetables and hay that supplied 3 regional markets. The cattle herd had grown back to 26 head. The old holding pond had been rebuilt properly, feeding the gravity irrigation system just as it had a century before. Margaret had hired 2 local teenagers for the harvest season. Ellie, now 15, had started entering her soil and crop notes into 4-H competitions, and had already been asked by 2 neighboring farms to help them think through their own struggling acreage. Wade still came by most weeks, though less as a rescuer now and more as a neighbor, sharing equipment, comparing weather predictions, occasionally arguing good-naturedly with Margaret over the best timing for a fall planting. Ray Tolliver, to his quiet credit, had become one of her regular apple customers, and never again used the word worthless in her hearing. The land had never actually failed anyone. It had simply been waiting for someone patient enough to ask why it was struggling, instead of simply deciding it was done. That, in the end, was the whole of the lesson. A piece of ground, like a person, is never worthless just because it has been misunderstood, neglected, or written off by people who never bothered to look closely enough to see what was still alive underneath. What do you think? Would you have given up on land like this, or held on the way Margaret did? Let us know where you're watching from, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that being underestimated isn't the same as being finished.